Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a co-hosted US-China series, US-China Business Council event on your Chinese supply chain complexities and challenges. And on behalf of myself, Paul Craik, and the team at US-China Business Council, particularly our moderator and my co-host, Anna Ashton, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. We're going to have a series of panels covering a slew of sectors relating to issues surrounding the Chinese supply chain. So Anna, I will just give everyone just some logistics and then we'll dive straight in. So everyone is currently on and will remain on a listen-only mode. If you have a question for the team, please put it into the Q&A function, type it in, and Anna will do her best to get to that during the course of the next 55 minutes. So Anna, thank you very much, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Paul. So good morning. Thanks for joining us today for this and any other panels you registered for as part of our full-day conference on US-China supply chains. This morning's first discussion is focused on the US-China apparel and textile supply chain, which has been caught up in international concerns about governance of Xinjiang forced labor in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. That's a Northwest Territory of China. Joining us are Nate Herman, Senior Vice President of Policy at the American Apparel and Footwear Association, John Foote, Partner at Baker McKenzie, and Amy Lehr, Director of the Human Rights Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. To briefly frame the conversation, in late July, more than 180 human rights groups launched the End Uyghur Forced Labor Initiative, which calls on companies to cease sourcing textiles from Xinjiang and cut ties with Chinese suppliers that may be tied to Uyghur forced labor. This summer, the Treasury Department announced sanctions against the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corporation. The State Department issued a Xinjiang supply chain business advisory, warning of potential human trafficking from the region, and Congress passed the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, which includes language calling on companies to ensure their supply chains are not compromised by forced labor. Lawmakers have also proposed limits and border blocks on imports of products with any content directly or indirectly sourced from Xinjiang. As soon as this morning, Customs and Border Protection may issue a withhold release order blocking all imports of Xinjiang-sourced cotton and products that may contain Xinjiang cotton, yarn, or fabric. Xinjiang supplies 1/6 of the world's cotton, which is processed into yarns and textiles globally, oftentimes blended with cottons from other sources around the world well prior to entering a company's manufacturing supply chain. Companies in many sectors are wrestling with how best to identify such cotton in their products, how to effectively demonstrate that their supply chains are not tied to forced labor concerns, and how to work constructively with government and the nonprofit community to figure out the best solutions and paths forward here. Mr. Herman represents the American Apparel and Footwear Association, a trade association representing more than 1,000 famous name brands, retailers, and manufacturers, which together employ nearly 4 million American workers. He leads the organization's corporate social responsibility program, formulating and implementing CSR work, and is a key leader in the Joint Association Forced Labor Working Group. Prior to joining AAFA, Nate worked for 6 years at the U.S. Department of Commerce's International Trade Administration, assisting firms in entering the global marketplace. Mr. Foote's international trade practice is focused on helping companies respond strategically to U.S. trade enforcement actions. He has particular experience on issues at the intersection of trade and labor, including the U.S. ban on imported goods made with forced labor and the rapid response labor mechanism in the USMCA. Ms. Lehr has extensive legal and international public policy experience working on issues surrounding corporate social responsibility, labor, and human rights. She's authoring a series of reports to expand what is known about Uyghur forced labor and supply chains and encourage multi-stakeholder engagement to address these challenges. The first report in the series, addressing forced labor in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region toward a shared agenda, was released in August, or in July actually. So each of our guests will provide an intro presentation and remarks, and then we will kick off a discussion. If you would like to submit a question for the discussion, I will do my best to include it. Just use the chat function or raise your hand, use the Q&A function and enter it there. And I will ask the question when I see it. And with that, I think we'll kick off with Amy giving us a lay of the land. And then we will go to Nate to explain the perspective of companies who are trying to address these issues, and then to John, who has the regulatory perspective.
Great. Well, I'm going to use a PowerPoint presentation, so please bear with me as I pull it up. Well, today I'll cover both what we know about forced labor in Xinjiang and related government programs that you should be aware of, and also the sorts of industries that are believed to be affected. And I just also want to start by saying that in a previous life, I spent a number of years in private practice advising companies on human rights issues. And this is one of the most challenging issues I've ever had to deal with because both just because of the severity of the problem, but also because of the host government involvement and because it's also touches on a lot of really hot geopolitical issues that make it much more challenging to address. So if you feel like this is a challenge, it is. So briefly, I just wanted to touch on what many of you probably already know, which is the kind of broad pattern of the human rights abuses we're seeing in the region. The US Holocaust Museum has said that these are potential crimes against humanity. We're aware that there are at least 1 million people who've been put into extrajudicial detention facilities, and now very large prisons are being built where we believe they're being transferred to on a more permanent basis. But some of those people are also being moved into labor. And I think what's interesting here as an American is sort of the use of labor as a form of re-education. The idea is that it helps reform thinking of, in this case, this ethnic and religious minority, and really brings them into a more materialistic mindset rather than having their previous linkages to their culture and religion. So that's, again, I think a way of, you have to understand that that is a belief that labor can do that to understand some of what's happening. I'll also just say for the Chinese government, what's happening in Xinjiang is all about stability, that they believe that stabilizing the region is an absolute top priority and that what they're doing is the way to accomplish that. Although obviously from an external perspective, the approach is deeply, deeply disproportionate to the threat and very problematic. There are a couple patterns of government-linked forced labor that are of concern. So the first is probably the best known, which is ex-detainees that are being detained either while they are, they're being forced to work either while they are still detained, or often when they're released from detention, then they're told that if they would like to not be detained any longer, they should really take these jobs. And in many cases, they're being severely underpaid and coerced. There are also poverty alleviation programs and related quotas for transfers to work, and I'll talk about that more in a second. Another area that I think needs more and more attention are prison populations. There's a long history of forced labor of the prison population in Xinjiang. Traditionally, those were mostly actually Han Chinese, but since 2016, there's been a huge uptick in the number of ethnic minorities being arrested in Xinjiang for extremist beliefs. And they now, from 2016 to 2017, it rose to 21% of all arrests in China, which is really significant because Xinjiang is relatively lightly populated. There are also obviously transfers of these workers to factories outside of Xinjiang that can pose supply chain risks to global companies. I'm seeing a slide. Okay, I'm seeing a slide, but I'll talk about poverty alleviation anyway. So poverty alleviation is basically an effort by the central government to move ethnic minorities into more traditional work versus, let's say, being herders, etc. And the challenge there is in its current iteration, officials are subjected to quotas. So they're expected to move a certain number of people into work. And that creates a very powerful reason to coerce people into these jobs because sometimes those officials' own well-being may depend on their success in this effort. And it's also being done in such a coercive atmosphere, right, with very high levels of surveillance and control. Pairing is another program you all should just be aware of. It's an effort to accelerate development in Xinjiang and enhance stability. Different other provinces of China are paired with certain regions of Xinjiang, and the key companies in those provinces are also part of the effort. They're strongly encouraged to be part of the effort. And that can play out a few ways. One can be donations. to poverty alleviation efforts. So that may be a donation to that regional part of Xinjiang to the government or to the XPCC. I just want to flag that there may be some sanctions risk there that deserves examination. But also there's expectations that they build factories in the region and potentially take workers from the government who might go to factories if they have them in Xinjiang, or might get transferred to these other parts of China to their factories there. And so that obviously is a key area of risk. And it's not that every company in pairing is doing all of these things. So you have to look at what the involvement is of that particular company. Briefly, just this chart shows what Xinjiang's top exported goods are. So these are exported internationally. I want to flag the fact that, we're missing a few letters in this, that these are not necessarily representative of what they produce as a whole, because most of that, they tend to produce precursors that then are used as inputs into more of the supply chain in other parts of China. It wouldn't necessarily be getting exported, but it gives you a little bit of a sense of what's being produced. The pairing program focus areas are as follows. And I think when you look at these, it doesn't mean there couldn't be risk in other sectors, but I think, if you are sourcing in any of these sectors from Xinjiang, you should be concerned and looking very hard at who your suppliers are. And maybe generally, if you think your suppliers in China or neighboring countries might then be sourcing from Xinjiang, you need to understand involvement in pairing. So actually the biggest area for pairing is agricultural production and processing, followed by textile and apparel manufacturing. We also see electronics and machinery, rare earth mining. Xinjiang is a major source of rare earths that are used in consumer electronics and aviation, plastics production and chemicals, and medical equipment. The exports from Xinjiang to the US actually have grown by 250% from 2019 to 2020, which was a surprise to me. You can see here, let me see. So chemicals are actually the biggest component coming into the US, but food's a major one, plastics, and I should note some of the chemicals are food precursors like amino acids, some minerals, metals, definitely some apparel, but it's not maybe as predominant as it might have been in the past, because some companies I think have shifted their practices in sourcing. But again, this is only what's being exported directly, so it doesn't take into account all the things that go from Xinjiang to other parts of China and then come to the US. Much of this is familiar. I'm just going to barely touch on it because I know that Nate is going to do a much deeper dive into apparel and textiles. But I just want to flag the fact that we did put out this brief in July that does a pretty deep dive into the different levels of the apparel and textile supply chain and tries to understand what Xinjiang's role is in those different levels of it and what the risk of forced labor is likely to be from what we know in those different stages. So just commend our brief to your review. I want to flag just a few key challenges for multinationals. And again, I know John will get into this more, but it's an area with such severe levels of surveillance and repression that you really can't do traditional labor audits. So that's one of the major frustrations, is that if you have a suspicion something might be problematic as a supplier, it's very hard to either prove that's not true or prove that it is in a definitive way. Auditors, Western auditors certainly can't get into the region. Han auditors have a hard time getting into the region. And then it's very hard to ask the questions that need to be asked, because they might be seen as, the auditors themselves might actually put themselves at risk by doing their job properly. CSIS in a report last October developed what we called a red flags approach to kind of look at your suppliers and try to assess how risky they are. That could be used for both companies in Xinjiang and other parts of China. But again, it's not perfect. It would just show you that there's a heightened risk. It won't be able to exonerate your suppliers or prove that they're not problematic. And last, as I said earlier, this is just really challenging because your leverage, if you were to think that there's a problem, leverage is really, really low. There's a state role in all of this. And so trying to fix these problems when they're identified is also going to be very hard, because you're actually trying to push against government programs. In terms of opportunities to affect change, I mean, I'm happy to talk about this more, but I think there's opportunities for a lot of different actors, and companies are one piece of the puzzle. So governments and multilaterals could be doing things such as supporting supply chain diversification. It's, I think for apparel and textiles, is going to be pretty important because China is so important for that sector. obviously the end goal is that the abuses actually stop, that China opens the region so we can know what's going on. It would be great if we could get, let's say, the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights in the UN to be able to truly access the region in a meaningful way and identify what the real problems are in a much more nuanced manner. Obviously, there are opportunities like blocking imports and sanctions that are more of the punitive variety and that governments are increasingly considering. I know the UK may be looking at global Magnitsky type sanctions in this context. Then there's companies and NGOs and other actors. I think there's a real opportunity for companies to improve their traceability. Right? The fact that many companies really don't know past tier 1 or 2 where their stuff comes from is a problem, and this has highlighted that problem. And I think there's an ability to work with other stakeholders on what is an acceptable quality and ability for traceability that everyone agrees is credible. Again, companies can play a role, and so can other actors, in diversifying supply chains and in encouraging governments to engage and act. I mean, beyond the US government, not that many governments are very seriously engaged on this issue right now because China is very important and it's very sensitive. So I'll stop there. I know the other panelists are going to have a lot to add to that. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Amy. And I think with that great lay of the land, we will turn it over to Nate to give us more of the company-specific perspective on these issues and how companies are wrestling with them and trying to address concerns.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks for the opportunity to speak on today's panel. And Amy, that was, of course, a great lead-in. I would also strongly recommend that if you have not looked at it yet, to look at the July CSIS brief that Amy and her team put together. It's a really comprehensive view, and it gives you a really good starting point on the lay of the land and what's happening there. So my job here is to sort of provide the apparel point of view. And so I want to give you sort of the context on which to look at this. As Amy alluded to, China is a very important supplier to our industry. Today, about 2/3 of all footwear, half of all travel goods and accessories, and about 1/3 of all apparel coming into the United States and sold in the United States are imported from China. Now, those numbers are down significantly from where they were before the US-China trade war. In 2016, those numbers were much higher. We're talking about 80% for travel goods, 75% for footwear, and about 42% for apparel. So we've done, the industry, because of the trade war, has been trying to draw down in China. However, China is very important not just for apparel, but also for textiles, yarns and fabrics. And those yarns and fabrics made in China not only go into apparel made in China, but they go into apparel made in Vietnam, in Cambodia, and Haiti, and Ethiopia. They essentially go all over the world. Further, China is the second largest market for US cotton, and will soon be the largest market for US cotton. In the first 7 months of 2020 alone, China bought $850 million worth of US cotton. Cotton is part of the phase 1 trade deal between the United States and China as a key product that China is supposed to buy and increase. And we've seen a 63% increase in exports to China this year alone. So this is a major supplier of China. Cotton is a major buyer of US cotton and the largest importer of cotton from around the world. They import cotton from Brazil, they can import cotton from India, Pakistan, North Africa, from all over the world. And why is that important? Because cotton is a very, what we call a fungible commodity. If it's long staple cotton, it's long staple cotton. It doesn't matter if it's from Uzbekistan, from Brazil, from Pakistan, India, United States, or China. It's still a long staple cotton. And so what happens in China is that the sources of all these cotton doesn't really, that they're not kept separate. They're mixed together because they're all long staple cotton. And so that also creates other issues. So just a brief on where the industry stands on these issues. We have a long history of addressing forced labor in our supply chains. first of all, we do not tolerate forced labor in our supply chains. And we've been working for well over a decade to try and address these issues. Not only address issues when there's allegations raised, to try and fix the problems when we see them and try and help the workers and remediate the situation, but also start larger initiatives, such as the initiative that we started with the Fair Labor Association called Commitment to Responsible Recruitment, to try and eliminate the possibilities of forced labor for foreign migrant workers in our supply chains, and basically make sure that they do not have to pay for their jobs, so they're not in sort of indentured servitude, that they have access and they control of all their documents and other issues. And so you can find that information on our website. But we have a long-standing commitment to fight forced labor in supply chains because we do not tolerate it. That gets us to the issue of Xinjiang. And Amy did a great job of explaining the scale, scope, and complexity of the issue in Xinjiang. There is a forced labor issue in Xinjiang, and everybody agrees to it. And we've been discussing that issue with our members for almost 2 years now, and educating them on what information is out there and what they should be thinking about and doing about the situation. But as Amy noted, this is not just a forced labor issue. This is an issue that goes well beyond forced labor. This is China trying to control and, depending on who you're talking to, assimilate an entire ethnic minority, what's been called cultural genocide, crimes against humanity, as Amy mentioned. And so it's a much larger issue. Forced labor is just one component of it that the Chinese government is using to continue control of the population in one way. Among many ways, and Amy mentioned some of those others, with the surveillance that exists in Xinjiang that rivals all the books that you read when you were kids, 1984, Brave New World, and probably goes beyond that at this point in terms of technology that they're using. And so it's an issue of scale, scope, and complexity that's never been seen before, and so we're trying to address that. And many have. Traceability is a very difficult issue, as Amy described. And so we've been spending the last 2 years trying to trace and track where the cotton in our supply chains are coming from, where the yarn in our supply chains are coming from, where the fabric in our supply chains are coming from. It's not an easy approach, especially as Amy mentioned, because normal due diligence that we get people on the ground, do their own inspections, that is not possible the way it is in other parts of the world. And so that creates a lot of problems. And so we've been also working hard, particularly over the last year, in looking at traceability technologies, using technology to address the issues. And there has been a lot of great work done in terms of DNA tagging, biomapping, DNA mapping, so that are getting us in the right direction, but they're not quite ready for prime time yet, if I had to put it like that. And so where I'm getting at is that we are taking this issue seriously. You've seen a small but fast increasing number of announcements from US apparel brands about what they're doing with relation to Xinjiang. But again, we're one part of any solution. We want to be part of the solution, but we should not be the entire solution to this problem, because the problem is much larger than us, much larger than just forced labor. And so we need the US government to really engage and bring in all the stakeholders that need to be part of this. Other governments, right now, Amy alluded to, there might be things happening in the UK, but really the only place where anything is happening is in the United States. The United States has done nothing to bring Europe along, Australia, Canada, Japan, Korea. The United States has really done practically nothing to try and bring those other countries, bring the UN, bring other international institutions into this discussion. They also need to bring all the stakeholders together to try and really address this issue in a comprehensive way. Because the issue is that if you just address one component of this, it's not going to make the entire house of cards fall. China will continue with what it's doing, it just won't use that one component. So we really need to address this issue holistically and comprehensively. So I'll stop there and look forward to hearing what John has to say.
Well, thanks a lot. Go ahead.
Oh, please, John, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Thank you, Nate and Amy. Always good to hear from both of you. So I just wanted to take the time today to talk a little bit about the enforcement actions that that have been rumored, that have been reported on this week, which Anna referenced at the beginning of her presentation, a potential withhold release order on cotton from Xinjiang or from cotton produced by the XPCC. And I just wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about what that means, what these orders are, and what sort of context we have for understanding what's going to happen when these orders are issued. They're commonly referred to as bans, right? A ban on cotton from Xinjiang, or a ban on cotton made by the XPCC, which is sort of true, but not exactly true. It doesn't exactly capture what a withhold release order is. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about it because, you know, as somebody who's been working on these issues, working on withhold release orders, helping importers navigate them, really since the beginning of this modern era of forced labor enforcement, which began in 2016 when the law was amended to remove a loophole and sort of inaugurated customs' renewed interest in enforcement, I have considerable uncertainty about what is going to happen when these orders are issued. And that's because there's just a lot that isn't known yet. There's a lot that customs could be telling us that they haven't told us yet. So I just wanted to level set a little bit on that. So in this modern era, since 2016, when Congress acted to remove a long-standing loophole in the U.S. import ban on goods made with forced labor, there have been 19 actions taken by U.S. Customs. These are orders that have been issued. They're called withhold release orders. A withhold release order is just an intra-agency memorandum from Customs headquarters to the ports. And what it says essentially is that the Commissioner of Customs has reason to believe that some class of goods, some category of merchandise, may be made with forced labor, and instructing the ports to withhold the release of shipments that are described in that order into the United States. They're supposed to detain those shipments at the port so that the importer has an opportunity then to prove that the goods were not, in fact, made with forced labor. If they can't make that showing, make that proof with respect to the individual container that's been detained, their options are to export the shipment or destroy it or abandon it, and Customs could seize it. So since in this modern era, there have been 19 withhold release orders that have been issued. There was one each from Brazil, Democratic Republic of Congo, Malawi, Turkmenistan, Zimbabwe, 2 from Malaysia, 9 from China, and 3 against individual fishing vessels, individual ships, seafood caught by fishing vessel number 61, flagged in this state, is believed to be made with forced labor. So if you're importing any product that is identified in one of these orders, your shipment will be stopped. But of these 19 orders, only 2 to 4 really deal with what we would call a broader class of merchandise, as opposed to merchandise made by an individual company. So the majority of WROs target goods that were produced by an individual company, XYZ company in China. And when an order targets XYZ company, it is a relatively straightforward question for Customs to decide which shipments get stopped, because Customs has immediate fingertip access to which shipments were manufactured by XYZ company, because it's part of the customs declaration. Every importer has to identify the manufacturer of the goods in the shipment that they're importing. So if XYZ company is named, that information is in customs possession. Every shipment that comes from an individually named company in a withhold release order will be stopped. But in the case of these broader orders that target a broader class of merchandise, and here I would refer to tobacco from Malawi, or gold from artisanal small mines in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or cotton and products containing cotton from Turkmenistan, Customs has to make some decisions about which products it thinks might contain that designated class of merchandise. This is a question which is referred to as commercial targeting, right? It's not always clear on the face of it which products contain Turkmen cotton, right? So you could have shipments of cotton directly from Turkmenistan to the United States. That's very clear. This is probably Turkmen cotton if it's cotton coming from Turkmenistan to the United States, or if you've got apparel that's been manufactured in Turkmenistan containing cotton, that one's relatively straightforward. But cotton is, as Nate pointed out, a globally traded commodity, right? So producers of cotton are oftentimes not the major manufacturers of apparel, and so that cotton goes to a lot of different jurisdictions. And what we don't know is the extent to which CBP enforces these broader category-wide orders or product-wide orders against shipments from third countries. So for example, if the data shows, as it does, that most Turkmen cotton does not ship directly from Turkmenistan to the United States, it's a little under $2 million every year of cotton products and textiles containing cotton shipped from Turkmenistan directly to the United States, which is a tiny percentage of Turkmenistan's overall output. The question is, well, which other shipments are getting stopped? How is Customs deciding what to look at where, right? Customs is obviously not stopping all shipments of cotton containing products from the entire world looking for evidence about Turkmen cotton. They have to make a risk-based decision to target certain shipments, certain imports. Turkmenistan, as I mentioned, has $2 million of annual cotton products and textile shipments directly to the United States. China shipped last year around $43 billion just of textiles to the United States. So to say that this is an order of magnitude difference, really undersells the scope and scale of the impact here and the increase of the impact here, right? This is like 200,000% more trade impacted if we just look at shipments directly from China. If we just set aside the question of the movement of Xinjiang cotton into global supply chains, making its way into Vietnam, Cambodia, elsewhere, this is a massive, massive increase, right? As Nate pointed out, that there's been a lot of work being done by the industry, by trade generally, by different companies and by different apparel and trade associations to try and work on traceability initiatives. But to be clear, it is not currently a requirement of US law that companies know the country of origin of the cotton fiber which makes its way into their products, right? So the current, what is currently known by companies, what is currently declared by companies, what is currently labeled by companies is a reflection of what the law currently is, right? So law requires that fiber content be identified and disclosed on apparel. So companies know what the fiber content is in their apparel. You can't import a t-shirt and sell it in the United States if you don't know the fiber content of that apparel. You have to know it. You have to label it. It has to be on the label. It has to be included, right? You cannot import a t-shirt from another country if you don't know the country of origin of the t-shirt. You have to know that information. It has to be labeled. It has to be on the product. It has to be included in your customs declaration. But there's no legal requirement that companies have to know what the country of origin of the cotton that is used in the product is. And as a result, companies don't generally know that information. I should say they haven't historically known that information. There have been a lot of efforts and a lot of strides taken over the last couple of years as this issue has really come into focus. And certainly in response to the Turkmen cotton order and all the work that the NGO community has put into focusing on cotton from Uzbekistan, I would say there's a lot of efforts there. But keep in mind, a lot of the efforts are by the biggest name brands and the most well-known players. They're the ones who are working the hardest on this issue, right? There's a lot of import activity, a lot of global trade activity that is undertaken by companies that don't have a public brand, that don't have a public image, and therefore aren't as incentivized to be on the pointy end of the stick from the NGO community, you know, advocating for sustainability or traceability rather. So what information is known to importers and brands, and what is known to CBP? Well, importers and brands don't all know where the origin of the cotton is that's making their way into their products, and customs knows even less, right? They know even less. So customs is going to have to come up with a set of commercial targeting rules, given that, you know, it was reported at the beginning of this week that these orders are ready to go and be issued imminently. Surely customs has commercial targeting rules, which are identifying what shipments it is going to detain and what shipments it is not going to detain. I'll just offer a couple thoughts about what I think are the range of possibilities here, and then we'll sort of pivot back for some questions. So, you know, at the high end of enforcement, customs could stop everything containing cotton from China and from neighboring countries. Okay, so when goods are imported, everything is classified, right? And there are some classification provisions that specify cotton. So if the good is like essentially predominantly made of cotton, it'll be classified in a cotton provision. There's also a provision that you have to declare if your product contains any degree of cotton, but is not classifiable in a cotton provision. So if it contains a small amount of cotton, you still have to calculate the amount of cotton that's in it and pay a cotton fee. So in theory, customs knows, again, what contains cotton and is being imported from China and Vietnam and Cambodia. So at the extreme end, customs could stop everything containing cotton from China and neighboring countries, and trade would break. I mean, I just don't, it's hard for me to envision that. It's not impossible, but that's one option. Another option would be essentially for customs to ignore the third country risk and say, we're only going to focus on shipments, you know, containing cotton from China. But again, at $43 billion of apparel total, and again, that only looks at apparel. Like I'm not considering footwear that contains cotton, or I'm just trying to pull some rough numbers together to give people a sense of scale. You know, customs could stop everything containing cotton from China, which again would be a massive, massive disruption. It's possible customs could say, well, we're going to stop, you know, only shipments that have a manufacturer ID code, which indicates that the manufacturer is located somewhere near Xinjiang. But again, a manufacturer is like the last step in the production process. And most apparel manufacturing, footwear manufacturing happens in the big cities in China and Eastern China. As Amy pointed out, there's not a lot of direct shipments from the Xinjiang region to the United States. And I don't know what, you know, sort of rationale there would be for delineating between different regions of China as being more reliant on Xinjiang origin cotton or XPCC produced cotton than others. CBP could engage in selective enforcement. They could issue the order and then detain only certain shipments from certain companies. They could cherry pick. They could go after sort of, you know, big targets or big names, or hit the big brands first because that sort of grabs attention and headlines. That raises a host of concerns on its own from, you know, due process perspective. So I don't necessarily think that would be the option that customs would go. So you can see, I mean, the range of possibilities here, from stop everything to stop like really limited and selectively, like none of them are good options. They're all sort of have major problems associated with this. And again, the real question for customs is, how are you going to decide what to stop? We have almost no precedent to go on. There's been no comment publicly about commercial targeting rules. There's been no public disclosure of that in the other context of the very few orders that we have that target commodities that lie upstream. I would just comment that, you know, for companies that sort of want to, or that, you know, sort of sailing by here, like if your goods are not detained after these orders are issued, are you in the clear? I mean, the answer is clearly not. And the Customs just issued or collected their first settlement on an attempted penalty action in the context of forced labor. So Customs has their own like penalty statute, and they pursue their own customs penalties if you engage in customs fraud, or you don't classify your goods right, or you declare the wrong value, or what have you. And they just used that tool for the first time to pursue a penalty on the basis of forced labor. And here, because it's happened precisely one time, they landed on a settlement. The company never acknowledged that their supplier was involved in forced labor. They never consented to it. They basically just said, we're not going to fight this anymore. Like, it's just not worth the cost and the time, but they settled it for over $500,000. Customs was looking for about an $8 million penalty on 20 shipments, all of which predated the issuance of the withhold release order at issue. So think about that. Customs issued a withhold release order. This company got tied up in the process. Customs conducted an investigation, looked at past imports, found 20 shipments which predated the withhold release order, and said, I want a penalty on that. They were looking for $8 million. The company contested it, never conceded that there was evidence of forced labor, but ultimately ended up having to settle it because the cost of fighting it didn't justify it any longer. So the idea that companies are in the clear if your goods just keep coming in, like, that's just not accurate. Like, you're just not in the clear. Could Customs look to penalize companies today before, based on import activity before the withhold release order? I mean, well, that's what they just did. They just imposed a forced labor penalty on the basis of shipments predating a withhold release order. So there is this question of sort of, when do companies become on notice, and what, whose responsibility is it? Does Customs have to prove that the forced labor is there? Does an importer have to prove? And what happens when the withhold release order is issued is the withhold release order is Customs saying, we presume this category of products is made with forced labor. We've looked at the evidence. Here's our presumption. Here's our belief. Now you can rebut it, right? You can rebut the presumption. So what does that mean? Well, again, if it's an order targeting an individual company, what that means is you would probably engage in a labor audit of your company. You'd come back with specific proof that says, look, I looked at this, and here's my manufacturer, here's my labor audit, here's the one that predates your action, here's the one that we took after your action. I don't see any evidence of forced labor. We didn't do any indicators. We did our interviews. We talked to the workers. There's nothing here, and Customs would evaluate that and then let your shipment come in. In the context of Xinjiang, where the forced labor audits have been sort of categorically exempted, what that means is that the only option you would have for obtaining clearance is to prove that your product doesn't contain the designated class of merchandise. Namely, what proof do you have that you don't have Xinjiang origin cotton or XPCC grown and harvested cotton in your supply chain? And that means that companies will have to stem the tide of probably some broader group of cotton making their way into the supply chain. For example, at the country level, you'd have to be able to show that, well, all the cotton used to manufacture, to weave, to spin the yarn, to manufacture the fabric that went into my individual product, all of that was imported into China. Now, fortunately, China is one of the largest importers, right? So if there's any glimmer of hope here, it's that China is one of the largest importers of cotton in the world. They're buying US cotton in unprecedented quantities. So there is a massive quantity of non-tainted cotton in China. And this comes back to Nate's point, like, no individual company, no trade association is capable of sort of driving that need forward, right? And there's going to have to be some partnership there by the U.S. government. There's going to have to be some partnership there by the government of China on the need to sort of link that imported cotton and get it into the supply chain. And of course, all this takes time. Withhold release orders, they go into effect like that. Okay, so I'll pause there. And,
yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just think that's a good place to jump off because of questions that have come in. Specifically, one of the questions is for you, Nate, but I think can be folded into some broader questions. It is, how is the American Apparel and Footwear Association, or is the American Apparel and Footwear Association working with the US government on things that you mentioned, like DNA tagging, biomapping, or any other methods of identifying which products were actually made with Xinjiang cotton? Is this something that the US government has sought to help you with, or that you've asked for help with?
So that's a great question. So the U.S. Department of Labor's Bureau of International Labor Affairs just had a request for proposal on traceability technologies to identify forced labor and child labor up the supply chain back to the raw material level. And the request for proposal closed actually this past Tuesday. So it's really recent. We strongly supported any proposal we knew about. We sent a letter of support to support those proposals, anything to move this ball forward. And so, first of all, that's great that the U.S. Department of Labor did that and recognized that. Although it would have been helpful maybe more like 2 years ago, this is still great in stepping us in the right direction, but this will take months before the grants are even awarded, much less we see the results of these proposals and initiatives. So we have been talking with State Department, Labor Department, and Customs and many others about the traceability technologies. We've been talking directly with a lot of the companies that are pushing these traceability technologies. I know Amy's also been talking to all these companies and trying to help set up pilots, trying to get information out on these programs through our forced labor working group that Anna, you mentioned before. And so we are sharing all that information with the government, and the government's trying to work with us on those issues, but we'll have to see where this ends. And I do want to note that the U.S. Customs Border Protection does have a contract with one of those traceability technologies, although we do not know what's covered in that contract or the scope of the contract.
I wanted to broaden the question actually really quickly, directed at Amy, but also at all of you, but starting with Amy. Amy, you have this extensive legal and international public policy background working on corporate social responsibility issues from at the UN, and also trying to pull together stakeholders from multiple countries. In everybody's presentations, there was some discussion of the fact that this isn't an effort that the US government has pursued multilaterally. There hasn't been any effort really to speak of to bring along Europe, Canada, Korea, Japan, other countries that are facing the same challenge of how to address this. What, in your experience, is the most effective way of addressing forced labor concerns that affect multiple countries? Does it matter that we're no longer part of the UN Human Rights Council? And then from Nate and John, any additional points that you have to make there about effectiveness of compliance and enforcement efforts when there is a multilateral initiative underway versus when there's not?
So maybe I'll make a few comments on the first piece, which is, it's not that the US has done nothing to try to bring other governments in, but this is obviously a very challenging issue for any government to engage on, because China is very important and this is a priority for China. And so when governments do say something, they tend to face consequences. If you look at Turkey's record on this particular issue, it's a good example. Pakistan as well. So it's hard for governments to say anything, and it is really important for the US to demonstrate a consistent, sort of unflappable dedication to these issues that isn't about getting China, right? It has to be about the underlying human rights issues to get other governments to go along. So this isn't about them going after China, it's about them standing up for principles. They stand up across the board with any government. So I think that's really important. I think the US definitely can do more, partly just in terms of really engaging very consistently in multilateral fora with our partners, making it clear we're not going to suddenly have a trade deal and quit talking about this issue, which is a concern. I do think also, though, that obviously part of this is about governments having pressure from their own citizens. And so what we're starting to see is more awareness globally, and that will help too, right? So it's sort of, maybe you could think of it as like a bottom up as well as a top down US pressuring people into this approach. But I just think having a really, really steady hand on the tiller on this for the US will be very, very important. And I don't think that has been there sufficiently yet. I don't want to say that the US hasn't done anything. I just think it hasn't been consistent and hasn't made our traditional allies feel secure in coming out as well, which they know is going to be really high risk if they do it.
Thanks. Nate, John, additional comments on benefits of trying to address these issues multilaterally, things that work better in that context, or that work better when one individual government decides to push ahead regardless of what others are doing.
I'll offer a comment about this, which is just that in the early 90s, when we were moving towards the normalization of trade relationship with China, China engaged in pretty extensive dialogue around the issue of prison labor, which was a major concern at the time. I mean, that was the major focus, I think, of human rights activists with respect to trade in the early 90s. And there were, in fact, some agreements, like China showed some willingness to move and to dialogue and to talk about these topics. There were some agreements that were executed. There were some memorandum of understanding that were signed. And all of those related to customs enforcement of 19 USC 1307, the forced labor import ban that we're talking about earlier. And China had objectives that it was seeking to pursue, and I think there was an understanding that, look, to the extent this issue intersects the production of goods that are going to be traded internationally, it becomes a matter of justifiable concern for other countries, right? I think there's sensitivity around what's a domestic issue, what's properly a domestic issue, and what's properly an international issue. When I look at the legacy of that period, and I look at the agreements and the dialogue and the discussion, I see a recognition that when issues affect international trade, it's a justifiable topic of discussion and points of negotiation. And China passed a law prohibiting the use of prison labor for goods that would be exported. Now there could be, there certainly are legitimate criticisms about the extent and success of those negotiations or what the outcome was, but there was a willingness to have a discussion. So, I would just say that clearly we're in a context here where the concern about human rights is not just sort of a matter of domestic affairs. I mean, this is linked to international trade, inextricably linked to international trade, which definitely merits, conversation and discussion, which at a multilateral level is always going to be more effective, but it's also going to be led by, led by a country with, again, the only law of its kind in the world. The U.S. is the only country with a categorical import ban on goods made with forced labor, and that is something that other countries are looking at. It's actively exported in the context of our trade agreements, including the USMCA. So those are a few thoughts from my vantage point.
Thank you. Nate, do you happen to have a perspective on how multi-stakeholder initiatives can be most effective?
So I want to bring up the example of Uzbekistan, and a lot of people have tried to compare what's happening in Xinjiang with the Uzbek cotton situation. And they're really not comparing apples to apples in that case, because it was specifically in Uzbekistan, the forced labor mobilization during each year's fall cotton harvest was a legacy of the Soviet Union days, and how they mobilized to produce cotton. Had no other issues. It wasn't talking about ethnic minorities, wasn't talking about a larger campaign. It was strictly forced labor mobilization to produce that year's cotton harvest. But in terms of multi-stakeholder initiatives, really when this issue was first, when we first started engaging in the Uzbek cotton issue in 2007, it was an egregious situation. The government mobilized about 2 million Uzbeks to help pick cotton every year in the fall cotton harvest. It was a system set up to, again, mandated by the Uzbek government to mobilize forced labor in order to get the cotton picked, because cotton was the foreign currency earner for the Uzbek government. And so what we did is came together as part of the cotton campaign, working with NGOs, working with labor groups, and working with others to work with the US government to then convince the US government to work with other governments, the European Commission, Japanese government, the Korean government, Australian government, Canadian government, and then to work with international financial institutions, the International Labor Organization, the World Bank, to finally mobilize enough of an international effort to convince the Uzbeks that they need to do something about this issue. And we're still dealing with this issue today. There's still forced labor in Uzbekistan's cotton fields, but instead of 2 million workers, including a lot of child workers, we're down to about 120,000 workers. And it's making a difference, but it's taken a very long time, and it took a huge multilateral government, NGO, labor group, business community effort, everyone working together to make the changes that we're already seeing in Uzbekistan.
I had a final question about how this might impact American retailers in third countries. For example, an American brand's retail store in Japan. I don't know that we have a ton of time to answer that because we need to wrap up before the next panel starts. So maybe if you can briefly say something to that in your concluding remarks. I really appreciate all of you participating today. Lots of enlightening facts that I think haven't been as clearly part of this story as they probably should be as we move forward in addressing these issues. I will turn it over to you guys very, very briefly. We have about a minute.
I think I'm guessing we mostly have businesses on the line listening. I would just say, I wouldn't feel safe because you're not an apparel and textile company, I guess is what I've seen from our research, right? That there are many more sectors that are implicated. And in my own conversations with journalists, the apparel and textile story is not so interesting anymore. So they're looking beyond that. So I would just flag whatever sector you're in, like you need to get on top of this immediately. And you are on notice now, right? The State Department and others have issued warnings. So this is coming. I also see more and more interest overseas. I'm getting contacts from overseas journalists more. There's more activity. So again, I don't think this is going away. Unfortunately, I don't think the underlying issues are getting resolved either. I wish it would go away because the problems would be gone. But that's not the situation. I also just want to flag that we will be putting out several more briefs, probably in the next month or so, on traceability, on diversification of supply chains, some thinking on like how to create some more of this multilateral leverage. So please check our website every now and then. Thanks. Bye.
Awesome. Nate, final remarks?
That this is an issue that's not going away. Our industry is taking the issue seriously, and we look forward to working with the U.S. government and other stakeholders to resolve the fundamental problem that exists that Amy was referring to.
Thank you. And John?
Yeah, thanks. I'll echo what Amy said. The only reason we're talking so much about apparel is because this is the apparel session, and because CBP is imminently issuing withhold release orders on cotton, which has a massive impact there. But the issue is obviously multi-sectoral. I'll say from customs standpoint, there is a real mindset, which is, well, if companies think that their stuff is going to get detained and they don't have proof, they'll just divert the shipments. They'll send it to Japan. Get stuff on the water, they'll send it to Canada or to Mexico. And that speaks to a reality, which is that the U.S. is the only jurisdiction with a law prohibiting the importation that obviously doesn't resolve the issue. I mean, there's reputational concerns. There's so many different stakeholders that are pushing on the issue, right? Like, well, what did you do with your, stuff that you couldn't prove wasn't made with forced labor? Well, we sold it in Japan instead. Not a very compelling answer to any stakeholder, so.
Thank you. Thank all of you so much. I think we probably could have made this a longer session. I feel that way frequently these days with China-related trade issues.